This might be the most important Overwatch 2 video you ever watched, especially if you're an aspiring pro player, coach, or someone serious about improvement. I've finally decided to sit down and take the time, something that I've been wanting to do really for the last 4 years, and explain my full thought process, my full strategy, my full vision of how Overwatch 1 and Overwatch 2 function as a first-person shooter. Every macro strategy, the entire thing. All the fundamentals, all the basic concepts, all the things that are going to help you climb, coach the game, improve the game, and really master the game all the way up to an Overwatch League rip and peace level. This is going to be kind of a scuffed video in terms of how we deliver it. I think the structure of it's going to be very clear. I'm going to try and explain each point very clearly. However, it's going to be on a whiteboard with a toilet paper roll used to wipe the color off of. So if you're here for presentation, okay, let's be honest, you're subscribed to me, you're not here for presentation anyway. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. This is everything Overwatch 1 and Overwatch 2 related. So first thing is, what is Overwatch? Overwatch is what I would call a strategic first-person shooter, a team-based first-person shooter, where the goal is to secure eliminations, secure kills, secure team wipes, so you can control spaces of the map. And we talk about what the importance of what a map is. The map just is a collection of two things, right? A map is a collection of objective-based goals where you're able to push point A to point B. That's really what drives the objective, is the motivation to get it from point A to point B, or to capture it, to stop them from capturing, and so on, right? But a map is another thing as well, and there are various positions around that objective that have various levels of importance. And what I mean by that is, if you want to push the objective from point A to point B, if the enemy team has these positions here, they will be strong enough to stop you from pushing the objective. So for you to be able to push the objective, you actually need to take away these positions so that you can actually push the objective. That's why so many times when we talk about low-ranked players, they have an obsession with the objective and not with the positions, because they don't understand that to push the objective effectively, they need to kill the enemy team or stop them from getting killed. And to kill the enemy team or stop themselves from getting killed, they need to take those positions away. And that's really where the importance of map and positioning comes away from. Not because it's fancy, not because the objective doesn't matter, but because the objective is so important that you actually need to take away the positions that will allow you to then contest or defend or push or attack the objective and so on. So I think it's the most important thing to understand is that when we talk about map control and space and angles and so on, what is space, what is map control? Really the easiest way to explain space and map control is just simply that you have powerful positions on the map that allow you to contest, control, or defend the objective easily. That's really all there is to it. And we ask, well, what are powerful positions? And that gets to be pretty simple in of itself. There's no real need to overcomplicate it. Hello, kitty, Graham. I have a cat in front of the camera. Hello. Sorry, I'm just getting over being sick and my cat is killing me. Okay. Health packs are very useful in winning duels. High ground is very useful for seeing the map as well as providing cover that's at your feet. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, I believe. Long sightlines, short sightlines, nice flanks, anything like that. All of those things provide inherent value in a combat situation. So we talk about map control, we talk about controlling space. Generally, you want to control areas around the map that have various advantages. So when we talk about making space or controlling the map, it's not some esoteric, complicated, really advanced high-level concept. It's just that spot really good for your character. You try get it. That's really all there is to it. And when it comes to what a tank, a DPS, and what a support does to make or create space, it's generally fighting using cooldowns, using our mouse 1 and mouse 2s to try and get those spots away from the enemy team so that I have an advantage. And then we can push the objective, or then we can contest the objective. And that's really all Overwatch is. That it's really not any more complicated than that. What's complicated is how each individual character has a unique kit that allows them to contest the objective, that allows them to contest and take duels, pressure the enemy team as a group or as an individual, and that's where things start to get a little complicated, is how each character does that, not to mention how each character has different limitations about what positions that they want and what positions that they don't want. So let's actually talk about 4 things in particular. There's 4 fundamentals of Overwatch 2, and they're not particularly unique, but they're very, very important. I've brought many of these up over the years, and if you're familiar with any of my content, you probably know. And we start with number 1. The number 1 is the plan. We'll go more in detail in all of these later on, but the plan is essentially, what are we doing? What's our strategy? What's the goal of our composition? What are we trying to do with our ultimates? What are we trying to do versus their ultimates? How are we dealing with the way that they're controlling the objective, the space that they control? Like, what's the plan? Like, what do we actually want to do this fight? The second one is timing. All right, I'm gonna run out of space because structure just isn't good in this video. Second one is timing. The timing is when do we do the thing that we want to do. I would say planning falls into the subsection of timing, like you can't have a good plan without good timing, and I would say you can't have good timing without a good plan. In other words, when you do the plan and what you're doing, you really can't have one without the other. Timing is one of the most important concepts of Overwatch 2, not because it's any more important than the other ones necessarily, but it's the one that I see messed up more frequently than almost any of the others, even all the way up to an Overwatch League level. We talk about what makes a good dive team, a good brawl team, a good spam team, to use some of those old definitions of Overwatch compositions. Really, the answer is always timing. Team play is timing. Team play is timing plus a plan. And you really can't have one without the other. I know so many teams, or even players in rank from bronze to top 500, that don't understand the importance of timing. Synchronizing pressure with your teammates is timing. Whether you're a tank, DPS, or support, your CDs, your mouse one, your pressure on the enemy team, your attempt to get a kill, you're shooting the enemy tank, you're shooting the enemy backline, you're pushing the objective, all of those things have to be timed properly. So these two are you really cannot separate these two as individuals. And then the last two fundamentals are going to be positioning is the other one. So this is one that obviously a lot of coaches, myself included, talk about a lot. I'm going to positioning. Look at that calligraphy, guys. Never say that it's not important. Yeah, positioning is just essentially how are you putting yourself on the map? Where are you putting yourself on the map to min-max your value? And to minimize your risk. You want to absolutely maximize value, minimize risk. That goes into a little bit of the map control and space control that we talked about earlier. But more often than not, it's just simply what is a good position for your character. And that's going to look differently if you're a Reinhardt, a Reaper, or a Widowmaker. Every single character has different things that they want to check off the list when it comes to the position. Widowmaker wants a long sightline, cover, and sightlines on the enemy team. And by a good sightline, I mean a long sightline, usually. Reaper would like a flank, if possible, an escape route back to his team, preferably, and cover. Something short, nice and short, right? So we talk about like what does every character want. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not so obvious, sometimes it depends on the situation, and sometimes it depends on the enemy composition, what positions that you want. And that's where positioning is really important and a little bit complicated. We'll get more of that later. But one thing about positioning that I think really encompasses the entire role is that positioning is always contextual upon where your team and where the enemy teams are. So I think it's really easy for us to watch some of the best streamers in the world, some of the best players in the world, and be like, oh, that position is where they're holding, that position is good. Position is always contextual about where your team and where the enemy team is. So instead of looking for positions to memorize, instead look for goals for your position. For example, if I'm playing Widowmaker, don't watch a great Widowmaker play and be like, I'm going to copy that spot. Instead, look for long sightlines. If you're playing Zenyatta, don't try and mimic what the best Zenyatta player is doing. Instead, look for good cover, good sightlines, good high grounds. Things like that are really, really important because the reality of the situation is in all ranks and in all maps, people position differently. People play the objective differently. People set up differently. A Reinhardt in bronze is not going to hold the same choke as a Reinhardt in top 500. So you will have to learn to adjust around your team and what the enemy team does instead of memorizing set positions. It's one of the first things that I learned when I was ranking up as a support player. So last thing we're going to talk about, and one of the underrated mechanics of Overwatch 2 is coincidentally mechanics. Now, when I say underrated, I will mean underrated by some, overrated by others. I think that's the nature of a lot of these, but especially mechanics. It's really easy to get into the game of Overwatch and feel like if I just hit another shot, we would have won this game. And it's also really easy to get in the educational community and feel like, well, if you just have perfect position, you don't need mechanics. And really, both are false, right? You need mechanics. Overwatch 2 is one of the most mechanically intensive first-person shooters ever. Maybe the most difficult first-person shooter when it comes to actually aiming your weapon. There's lots of ways of getting away with not having amazing mechanics by being strong at many of these other aspects. But there really is nothing that can replace good mechanics, and mechanics will always be one of the pillars of any first-person shooter. But it's important to frame mechanics under matchups. So we'll talk more about the individual aspects of mechanics. There's 3 frames of mechanics, but everything about mechanics is about your matchups, like knowing how to apply your mechanics to win a 1v1, to secure a kill, to beat the enemy tank in a 1v1, to beat the enemy DPS in a 1v1, to beat the enemy support in a 1v1. And by beat them, I don't necessarily mean eliminate them, I mean make them demand more resources than you demand. If I'm playing Reinhardt versus Zarya, if I don't know how to win that matchup with how I use my cooldowns and how I hit my shots with my fire strikes and my swings, how to manage my shield, that falls under the mechanics category. You have to know that matchup. If I don't know how to outplay an Ana as a Reinhardt, if I'm not comfortable shooting the Kiriko hitbox as a Widowmaker, if I'm not comfortable hitting sleep darts and Genjis as Ana, if I'm not very good as a Tracer with my Blink melee, specifically in the Tracer mirror, that's going to be very difficult. So it's not just about hitting your shots, but also about knowing your matchups. Everything is under the context of matchups, because let's face it, Overwatch 2, you're not shooting training bots. You're shooting different hitboxes, different characters with different kits to deal with you in different ways. And so while the game is a team game, and it's not really a 1v1 game, a team game is really just an accumulation of multiple brief 1v1s. Not true 1v1s for multiple seconds, but 1v1s that are supported in both sides, and you're going to shoot the Ana for a little bit, then you're going to shoot the Kiriko, and if you don't know how to shoot the Ana, or if you don't know how to shoot the Kiriko as Hanzo, that's going to fall in mechanics. And so every character has to kind of learn how to approach that in different ways and different situations. So each of these is going to have 3 branches, and we're going to talk about these, but I'm going to remind you that planning comes off of timing, and good timing comes off of a good plan, knowing what to do. Mechanics is all under the umbrella of matchups, and positioning is all under the context of when and really where, your team is positioned and where the enemy team is positioned. So before we get into the branches, I want to remind you, again, these are under the sub-context of each other. This is under the context of their matchups, and this is under the context of where your team is positioned as a whole. And you really cannot forget those, because before we get into some of the details, it's important to kind of put the context of that. So, as I said, let me know if you have any questions, but this is Overwatch macro, this is Overwatch 2 macro, this will be, for as long as the game is out, this is exactly how the game is solved, so this will always be relevant. So let's actually move on to the planning thing. So plan. Now why do I always start with plan? I used to always say that planning is the most important thing, and I think you could really argue about any of these being the most important, and I don't really think it matters, but let's just put it this way. Planning is very important. Planning is knowing exactly what you're doing. Now, with this particular leaf of the tree, there's going to be a couple of details that you might not be doing right now. Maybe you've heard of in like a coordinated competitive team environment that you don't really do in ranked. That's okay. Not all of these are things that you absolutely have to be executing on in ranked to succeed. They will be helpful, but it's not necessary all the way. This is kind of looking at things from a mixture of a ranked and a competitive team environment, high-level Overwatch standpoint. That being said, these things, if you could do them in ranked, would absolutely benefit you and be very important. So let's actually take a look at that. So planning falls into 3 branches here. The first branch is the ult track branch. And ult tracking is simply what ultimates do the enemy team have. I would say, along with positioning, map control, ultimates are the most valuable resources in Overwatch. When you have good positioning and good map control, you have something that will feel like an ultimate. But ultimately, ultimates are ultimates in themselves. And the most powerful resources the in-team can control, and they heavily sway how a team will take a fight. For example, a Genji that has Blade will behave very differently, set up very differently, make different choices in the middle of a fight than a Genji without Blade. Sorry, with Graviton, Reinhardt with Shatter, Lucy with Beat, and so on. Ult track is everything because it tells you exactly what the enemy team might do to you. It's important for you to have a plan yourself, but if you don't know or have no idea what the enemy team might be planning, then you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. And I actually think in a solo queue environment, not in a coordinated team environment, ult tracking is one of the most underrated skills that you could be developing, even just as a solo player. I remember one of the biggest things that I started doing as a support player and on and Zen player back when I was climbing Grandmaster was spend time tracking what the enemy team had. And I didn't just do this because, oh, I know what to trance. That's obvious, right? What do I use my ultimate versus depending on what they have, right? But I would change my entire positioning because they had Earth Shatter. I would play more aggressively when I knew that they didn't have the ultimates to punish me for playing more aggressively. I would know that their Sombra would have EMPs, so to adjust my positioning accordingly. I would think about things like Infrasight, right? And there's so many different ways as a tank DPS and support that you will significantly benefit from having an idea of what ultimates the enemy team has. And then obviously in a team environment, it's incredibly important to know what they have because that shifts very heavily what the second leaf is. And that is simply the ult plan, right? And so this is the other side of the coin where it's, okay, we know what they have, this is what we have, what are we going to do with those ultimates, right? What are we going to do with our ultimates? What are we going to combo? Are we going to use one then the other? We've talked a lot about layers in my lasagna video. You might have seen that, Overwatch 2 layering. Very important ultimate strategy. But regardless, you need to have a plan with what you're doing with your ultimates. Okay, we know what they have, we know what we have. What are we going to do about it? Are we going to use our ult to counter their ult? Are we going to try and use our ultimate first? Are we going to let them go first, then use our ultimate second? We're not going to get into the details of all that right now. But ultimately, when you have a plan, the two most important things that you need to be factoring in are going to be the track of what they have and the track of what we have. And if it sounds like that's easy to do in a coordinated team environment, you'd be surprised at the number of teams, even at the Overwatch League level, that were inconsistent at doing just these two basic things consistently and concisely. Very, very important. Now, this one is definitely tricky in a ranked environment because you might be thinking, well, I don't really talk with my teammates, or my teammates don't talk to me, or I get in voice and I try and play and they don't listen. This is probably the one that's the least consistent in a ranked environment. I would say focus on utilizing a plan for your ultimate. That should be a priority. But don't try to rely too much on your teammates when it comes to the ult plan. This is something you can do by yourself and you can get value by yourself. This, it's a lot harder. And I wouldn't worry too much about it in a ranked environment unless you're stacking with friends. But yeah, I don't worry as much about this one in a ranked environment. Last thing, when it comes to the overall plan, is the composition. We'll abbreviate that as comp, the comp matchup. And that is essentially how does our hero group of heroes match up versus that group, their group of heroes. In other words, when we're playing Reinhardt, how does a Reinhardt play versus a Malga composition? How does a Widowmaker play versus a Tracer? How does a dive beat a brawl, or brawl beat a dive? And again, this one can be tricky in ranked because a lot of times you're going to play what we call hybrid compositions, where it's really just a collection of random heroes, right? But even in a team environment, right, I see this sometimes gets messed up, where people don't really understand what are the strengths, what are the weaknesses, what are the advantages, what are the disadvantages of our composition versus the enemy composition. What are their strengths versus ours? And so, you can have a good idea of what you're doing with your ultimates, but if you don't even understand like what makes our comp good, what makes their comp good, and how do we play around that, then you're gonna have a hard time. In fact, you might not even know how to properly plan around their ultimates and how to plan around yours. So it's really important that you have, I would not say an in-depth understanding, but at least a surface level understanding of exactly what we need to be doing versus their composition. And specifically what space and what positions we need to be controlling. I think one of the biggest mistakes that I see from aspiring coaches, even some old school, old guard coaches that are still making content occasionally these days, one of the biggest mistakes that I see when they come describing compositional matchups is they talk about tempo. They need to play fast or we need to play slow. That is one of the worst things that you could be thinking about when it comes to Overwatch 2. Any composition in Overwatch 2 can play fast. Any composition can play slow. It is not about the tempo with which you play, it's about the space that you control. When we talk about a Reinhardt composition, a Reinhardt comp plays fast, right? No, a Reinhardt composition plays in close range. And if you're playing Reinhardt to spam, you don't need to play fast, you need to be looking for positions that complement your close range. That's it. You could play slow in close range versus a spam comp, if you can get up close. Spam comps, you don't play slow versus a Reinhardt, you just take long sidelines, and that's all there is to it. Dive comps, you use high grounds and you use flanks and angles, things that utilize your mobility to their best ability, right? So when it comes to deciding and understanding the compositional matchup, always start with what positions does our composition do well with? What kind of an angle does Tracer want versus a Widowmaker? What kind of an angle does a Winston want versus an Orisa? Right, and if you can answer those questions, you'll be well on your way to understanding the compositional matchup. And this is, again, something that you can kind of utilize a little bit in a ranked, at least in small subsections. If I'm playing versus a pharmacy, I know that that pharmacy wants verticality and she wants vertical cover. So if I can adjust my positioning around that to discourage that or avoid that or counter that, then that's going to be able to play that compositional matchup favor. If I'm playing Sigma and the enemy team is playing Orisa, I want to take a longer sightline earlier so that I can get early pressure on the Orisa because I have better range than she does. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a later leaf, but for right now, compositional matchup, ult plan, ult track. This is all the subset of leaf number 1, the plan, when it comes to the Overwatch 2 macro. And we're going to move on to timing because, of course, we have to. Those two are really put in together because how do you and when do you execute the plan? And that always goes back to timing. So timing, like the other one, has 3 leaves. And I want to remind you that timing and plan and timing go together. It's impossible to have one without the other. So the first leaf of timing is going to be the look. Got a funny story. I used to play quick play and deathmatch when I was practicing my mechanics years and years and years and years and years ago. I would play quick play or deathmatch, and I'd turn the sound off while I was listening to a podcast or some sort of coaching thing. And it was remarkable how I would actually sometimes play better in deathmatch and sometimes even play better in quick play because the sound was off. And it would force me to be a lot more attentive to what was going on. I'd check my periphery, check my angles, and check my flanks a lot more because I was basically relying on one sense a lot more than I was otherwise. And it's honestly astonishing how important timing is and how much easier it is, rather, when you're paying attention to what's going on. When do I go in? When do I engage? When do I need to actually put out pressure? If you're not paying attention to what's going on around you before that fight starts, and sometimes even as the fight is starting, you're going to severely mess up your timing and consistently mess up your timing. Look is not just about being aware of your surroundings to keep yourself alive. Looking around you is also knowing when do I actually take action? When do I actually commit? Many of the dive characters specifically really struggle with the look because they're on their own, they're doing their own thing. They don't have the awareness of what and when their team is actually committing. So because they don't have that awareness, they tend to mistime their pressure, and even though it's the best dive in the history of the universe, the team isn't spawned. They needed 5 more seconds. And so look is by far the most important thing you can be doing when it comes to timing. We're gonna keep moving on. Oh, and by the way, you're gonna notice with this, as we put in listen, you're going to notice that the branches of timing are really the branches of communication, and that's not an accident. The reason you communicate in Overwatch 2 is for 2 reasons: your plan and your timing. That's it. You don't necessarily need target focus. You don't necessarily need words of encouragement, although they are helpful. You don't necessarily need people calling cooldowns necessarily. You just need communication to know what the plan is and when are we doing it. 99% of communication, quality communication in Overwatch 2 comes down to engagement timing and what are we doing and when are we doing it, right? So you'll actually notice that timing and plan in many ways are really just communication. They're really just communication, either non-verbal or verbal. So you're going to ask me like, why isn't there communication? Isn't that one of the fundamentals of Overwatch? Yes, but it falls under the category of timing and plan, all right? Listen. They always say that you should be listening twice as much as you speak because you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that's fine and all, and it's cute, but it is kind of true. I think listening is not just about listening to your teammates, not just listening to your teammates' actions, but also listening to what the enemy team does. We want to talk about cooldown tracking, right? Knowing when and where to go, right? When is a good time to engage as ball? Oh, well, that Anna's used sleep dart. Well, you're not going to know that if you haven't seen her use sleep dart, or you haven't heard her use sleep dart. So it's about knowing the timing of things, knowing when to go based off of what you can hear from your team, what you can hear from the enemy team, whether it's the status of cooldowns, ultimates being used, the position, maybe somebody's taking an angle or a flank on you, maybe you are taking an angle and flank on them, you need to know when and where to go. You hear your Reinhardt commit his charge, that's a perfect time to go. So knowing when and where to go is heavily influenced by what you can hear and what you can see. Sometimes you're going to be relying on one of these, and sometimes you're going to be relying on the other. If you can't see, you're usually listening. If you can see, you usually don't have to listen, although it can be helpful too. So really, one or the other, depending on the circumstance. That's really all there is to it. And the last aspect of timing, especially in a team environment, is going to be speaking or saying something, talking, calling, communicating. Basically, the concept is that knowing when either you're ready to go or calling when you are going. And that's the fundamentals of speaking. Now, some of you in rank might be like, well, I'm always shot calling or calling when I'm going in. It just doesn't matter all that much. I would say the most important call that you can be making in rank is when you're going in, when you're making a play. After you've checked to see if your team is ready. After you've listened to see if the enemy team was in a good position to engage on. But yeah, even in a ranked environment, this can still be pretty useful. Even if your team doesn't always follow up in the way that you'd like, at least giving them that communication of I'm going in, not saying, hey guys, let's push, but I am going in, can be very helpful. And then obviously in a coordinated team environment, calling your engagement timing, calling when you're set up, calling when you have, you've committed and you're ready for this. Again, all under the subset of timing. Speaking can be very important. I would say it's arguably the least important and one of the more overrated things in the team environment, because actually most teams that I've coached, it's not necessarily the quantity of comms and communication that's bad, it's the quality, where there will be a lot of cooldown calls, and a lot of random calls, and a lot of just talking, but there's not a call about when to actually go in. And there's a lot of communicational clutter about calling random things, but nothing actually gets done. So in a lot of ways, communication is the least important thing because all you need to do is check off the box of let's call a crucial cooldown when we see it, let's call when we're set up, let's call when we go. And that's really all we need to be communicating. We don't need to be saying anything more than that. And the less that you say, the more that your mouth doesn't have to do this, and the more that your hand can do this and actually hit your shots. And for a lot of people, myself included, the more that we talk, the more it starts to suffer or really reflect in our gameplay. And I think that goes even for professional players as well. So, timing and planning, can't do one without the other. Let's actually move on to positioning here. So positioning is the leaf that kind of splits off from the triage, or not really the triage, but the duo there, I guess. Triage is not the term at all. Triage doesn't even imply three, but yeah, anyway. Positioning. Positioning, it has its own subset, if you guys remember, of, what was the term I used? Around your team. I wanted to figure out what term I used. So around my team. Your enemies, oops. I said apologize for the calligraphy, or your team. So yeah, around your enemies of the team. So positioning is always contextual around where's my team, where is the enemy team, what position should I be taking? And there's gonna be three subsets of positioning. But positioning is essentially what spots on the map do I want to position, where are they going to be most useful for me to do the most damage and have the least amount of risk. Obviously all of this is also contextual off of the objective as well, but that generally goes without saying. So let's talk about positioning leaf number one, which is something I've been developing more recently in Overwatch 2, and I'm honestly surprised that I didn't do it before. There was a fairly well-known Overwatch coach in Overwatch 1 who was doing a little bit of content a long time ago. And he had a video on like how to play a compositional matchup, and I think in his Twitch chat or something, and he was talking about how like this composition, we needed to play fast or needed to play slow. And I'm in his Twitch chat and I go, couldn't that composition actually play fast if they did it on a longer sightline? Because it was a spam comp versus a brawl comp, and I was thinking like, why does the spam comp have to play slow if they're already on a long sightline? What if like the spam comp like went for a really aggressive like through all their cooldowns immediately, right? Why do they have to wait to use their cooldowns if they're out on the long sightline? And he gave me some pushback, and we had a bit of a discussion, and I realized that, man, this guy, he's totally wrong. He's absolutely totally wrong. It's actually not at all about the tempo at all. It's about simply putting out pressure when the sightline makes the most sense. And that's when I started to realize, I kind of go down that rabbit hole, this must have been 4 years ago, where I realized that tempo is a totally worthless word, almost totally worthless word, because really the only thing that matters in Overwatch 2 when it comes to positioning is range, right? We talk about what's the difference between a Widowmaker and a Reaper. Does a Widowmaker play faster, or does a Reaper play slower, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. A Widowmaker is a long sightline character, Reaper is a short sightline character. And that's all there is to it, and that's really the only thing you need to be thinking about when it comes to range, right? You don't need to be thinking about tempo, because the longer a Reaper stays in a short sightline, the more value he's going to get, and vice versa for a Widowmaker. So all you need to be thinking about when it comes to range is, what is my hero's range? Now, the only tricky part about this is that this is always contextual on your matchup. If I'm playing Sojourn, great example, because Sojourn is a character that has medium range, but if you're playing Sojourn against Tracer, you're going to be playing her not exactly like a sniper, but closer to a sniper in that aspect. But if you're playing Sojourn into a Widowmaker Hanzo, you're generally going to avoid peeking that Widow Hanzo until you have Rail, right? So she's going to have good range, long range, sometimes if she's playing versus divier characters, because she's a longer range than them. And then she's only going to play like a sniper versus a Widowmaker Hanzo when she has the cooldown that allows her to contest them. And this gets more complicated with characters like Soldier that are very middle of the road. You have characters like Genji, right, that are generally going to be playing up close, but then even versus characters like Reaper and Tracer, generally Genji will play a little bit more pokey until later on in the fight. So basically, range is essentially understanding what is my character's general range, and then looking at the enemy composition and be like, should I adjust which angles that I control, depending on the range of the characters that I'm playing versus. So very, very important. Very, 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 very important. And always remember that unless you're a character like Widowmaker or unless you're a character like Reaper, your effective range may depend upon what the enemy team runs. Okay? Very, very important. Next one is going to be angles. We talked about that just a few seconds ago, but angles. Angles are extremely valuable. In a video, I might link that in the comments, somebody remind me about all the benefits of angles, denying cover, giving you better vision of the enemy team from a different sight line, splitting up the enemy attention. Taking an angle can also reduce the effectiveness of movement, where the enemy team is 80-80 strafing, only works for the person in front of them. So if they have to turn, one person has an angle where they don't have to worry about the 80-80 strafing. The other benefit of angles as well, going back to range, is that generally if you have a Reaper and a Reinhardt, they want to play the same sight lines, right? But if I'm playing Widowmaker, I don't want to stand with my Reaper and Reinhardt because that angle is very short range. So I might take a different off angle that is a little bit of a longer sight line that complements me. If everyone's always grouped up, somebody's not happy about that sight line, right? Almost always, unless you're playing a big group brawl comp. So basically, angles are good ways of splitting up enemies' attention, finding access to avoid the enemy tank and immediately go for backline, the squishy underbelly, denying cover, many benefits to angles. And when it comes to Overwatch macro, a lot of positioning when it comes to solving when and where we should position comes down to like how do we set up at least one off angle, whether it's with our DPS or tank or other support. So it's always about finding different ways to set up angles to split attention and control the map. Because the thing about angles is if you control an angle, the enemy team doesn't control that angle on you. And that's one of the other important things about angles is the defensive value about proactively fighting for those angles so that if you group up, you're getting slammed from those angles. But if you contest those angles, you get to use them and you stop the enemy team from using them. In fact, there's a lot of high-level macro compositions where it really just comes down to teams fighting for angles, living and dying on flanks, right? When it comes to the actual main fight, there's not actually as much happening. So anyway, angles very important, very important. Both of these things are very important and ranked. What angles should you be taking? Depends on your range, depends on if that angle has cover, and always depends on where is my team. You want to be taking angles around your team. You don't want to be on your team, but you want to be taking off angles around where the enemy team is and around where your team is. So you don't want to be a solo player, you want to be a team angle player. And the last thing when it comes to positioning, and this is really just the easiest one, I remember having a session with IOStucks back, it must have been 2017 maybe, and one thing I walked away from that is the importance of cover. Cover is everything. Cover is everything when it comes to choosing what is the absolute best position, because cover is what allows you to dramatically reduce your risk while not at all affecting your reward. In fact, increasing your reward, because the longer you live, the more damage you do and the more likely you are to get eliminations. Cover generally will not stop you from being one shot, but it will stop you from being 2-shot and 3-shot and 4-shot and 5-shot and so on. Cover is what will allow you to keep your life without really changing your overall play style in terms of playing less aggressive or more aggressive. You just play the exact same and you cut down your deaths dramatically. Cover is just simply the ability to take aggression that's being put at you and avoid it from actually resulting in a kill, prevent it from actually resulting in a kill by simply ducking behind cover. Cover could be horizontal in terms of it is on the floor, so you're on high ground, and to get cover, you just simply drop backwards to where they can no longer see you up there. The floor itself can be covered. It can also be vertical, where you obviously, and it usually is vertical, where you move simply behind a wall so that it can no longer shoot you. But cover is one of those end-all be-all of not just Overwatch 2, but just first-person shooters as a whole. Cover, obviously, is everything when it comes to Overwatch 2. And honestly, it's something that's underrated for many people because it's boring. And also because a lot of people play tank, and they think that because I have a huge health pool, I don't necessarily need to be utilizing cover, which couldn't be further from the truth. Just because you don't die, cover can also, doesn't mean that cover isn't good. Cover can also reduce the amount of resources that you demand, right? Save a lot of your Ryan shield HP by utilizing cover. It doesn't matter whether you're tank, DPS, or support, you need to be utilizing cover. Also, quick shout out to flankers, tracers, you benefit a lot from using cover, keep that in mind. Okay, last tree here is mechanics. So we talked about how positioning is all under the subset of positioning around your team and around the enemy team. Mechanics falls under the subset of knowing your matchups. So we talked about that earlier a little bit, but I'll briefly touch on it again, which is simply knowing what you're playing versus 1v1. We'll just put 1v1 here. So how do I use my cooldowns? How do I use my ultimates? How do I use even my weapon? Well, that always depends on what you're trying to 1v1. Because really Overwatch 2 is a team game really a microcosm of multiple brief 1v1s that happen every single team fight, whether it's with the tank, DPS, or support, and so on. So everything in Overwatch 2 is about utilizing your abilities versus a character or characters on the enemy team that you're trying to out-trade. And while not just utilizing, knowing how to use your abilities, but knowing how they want to use their abilities on you and playing around and avoiding that. So first leaf of mechanics is the obvious one, M1 and M2. Basically your primary fire and secondary fire for those on console, right? How much damage can you do with your primary fire? How much damage can you do with the secondary fire? When should you use which? When should I beam as Zarya, and when should I right-click the explosion as Zarya? Am I accurate with placing my mouse crosshair on that target? And when do I actually not want to be accurate? How do I move around those things? I think you could also probably incorporate M1 and M2, and we'll actually, if you want, we'll throw in WASD as well. Because mechanics also includes movement. So we'll include that one as well. So mechanics and movement, whether it's the movement of your keyboard, the movement of your mouse, and also keeping in mind that how you move even changes depending on what you're fighting. How you strafe versus a Widowmaker versus a Tracer is completely different. How you aim as a Widowmaker versus a Tracer is completely different. So your ability to not only read that, whoever you're 1v1ing, but also be very comfortable with aiming and moving with the characters that you're playing is incredibly important. And there's really no shortcut with this, right? I think deathmatch is a great way to grind it, but really it's just ranked. It's just ranked. I think for people that are new to PC, they could benefit from aim trainers like Kovacs, but ultimately once it gets to a certain point in time, really nothing you can do besides just play more Overwatch and play just Overwatch. So I highly recommend prioritizing mechanics until you feel like that maybe that's not necessarily a huge issue with you, but even then everyone would benefit from mechanical practice. Movement, M1, M2, and knowing exactly how to use those cooldowns, knowing how to use your mouse, how to use your keyboard, depending on what you're playing and what you're playing versus. All right. Next tree of mechanics is going to be CDs. Excuse me. And this one is again pretty self-explanatory. It's not just knowing how to aim your CDs, but also when to use your CDs, how to use your CDs. I think obviously this falls a little bit under the subset of timing as well, right? When do I actually use my CDs? It's a very important question. You can use your CDs literally off of cooldown. You can be leaving spawn and use your CDs. It doesn't matter, right? Well, it does. It depends. So knowing how to maximize the value of your CDs when the fights actually happen, and then obviously to be able to actually hit your CDs. Knowing how to use a dash as a Genji versus a Tracer. Knowing how to use dash versus a Hanzo. Knowing when to use dash. Knowing when not to use dash. Knowing when to use bubble as one. Knowing when not to use bubble. Knowing how to adjust how you play when you don't have bubble, and knowing how to adjust how you play when you do have bubble. How to use bubble versus a Roadhog. How to use bubble versus an Ana. How to use bubble versus a Brigitte. How to use bubble versus a Widowmaker. All these things are mechanics of how to use the cooldown. And that comes through thousands of hours of practice and really understanding each and every single matchup. And Overwatch 2 is not getting any smaller when it comes to the character cast. So knowing how to use that CD versus every single character, and some characters very, very wildly in terms of how you actually utilize that cooldown. So very, very important when it comes to cooldowns. Overwatch 2 is a cooldown-based game. That's what makes it unusual to a lot of other first-person shooters. And if you don't know how to use your cooldowns from a mechanical standpoint, and also just knowing your matchups, right? Always comes back to matchups, then you're gonna have a hard time. And finally, the last leaf, if you guys didn't already guess already, is the ultimates. Like, how do you use your ultimates? When do you use your ultimates? Who do you use your ultimates on? And obviously knowing the matchups of those ultimates are very important. Ultimates are the highest value resource in the game next to positioning. So knowing exactly when, where, how to use those ultimates, incredibly, incredibly, incredibly important. So make sure that you understand, again, not just the character that you're playing, but also the character that you're playing versus. One of the biggest things you can do in Overwatch 2 is just simply get a solo ult and just get immediate value from using that ultimate. One kill is a kill, right? But obviously, if you don't know how to utilize that ultimate, if you solo Shatter versus a Life Weaver, and a Life Weaver just life grips the target out, you need to know your matchups better, right? You need to either force that cooldown out earlier or get more than one person with that Shatter. If you're Dragon Blading, but you don't know the mechanics very well of a Dragon Blade, or you don't know how to play Dragon Blade versus a Cassidy, don't know how to wait out or bait out the flashbang or the sticky grenade with your deflect, and then be able to chase after his roll with dash. There's a lot of things that you need to know, not just, oh, I have this ultimate, but how do I actually win that matchup? And then win the next matchup, and win the next matchup, and win the next matchup. So that's going to pretty much wrap it up. But a little bit longer than expected, but there's a lot to cover here. Now you need to ask yourself, what do I do with these with all this information? And I think that's probably the toughest question to answer of all. This is Overwatch 2. Everything that I point out there are the very bare bones, the skeleton of Overwatch 2 that will forever be part of the game. But how do you actually improve that? I think that it's going to depend on you. It's going to depend on the person. It's going to depend on not just the person, but depend on your situation. I think everyone can look at the last 15, I don't know how long it's been, 20 minutes, and go, oh yeah, I haven't thought about that, or oh, I probably need to pay attention to that. So for you, it's less about swallowing the entire meal whole, but about finding which dish, which side, which leaf of which tree that really feels like something that you need to be improving on, or you need to be understanding better, and then going to go work at that, going and improving that. I think more than anything else, it's not about trying to swallow the entire tree whole, but about finding which subsection you could be improving your own understanding at, and then improving that by playing more, studying the game more, spending more time in replays. And obviously that's going to depend on what your goals are. If you're a coach, it's going to be more studying, more time practicing, and more time trying to practice coaching that aspect and studying that side of the game more. And if you're a player, it's going to be about spending a little bit of time studying and a lot more time actually practicing that concept in game. And so I hope that this isn't just an esoteric little study of Overwatch 2 macro that's dry and of no particular use to anybody, but that somebody actually finds a way to utilize this and actually execute this in game, whether you're a coach or a player. I don't care if you're a professional team player or if you're just a simple bronze player. I hope you found this one useful. This has been a collection of really many years of coaching this game, trying to boil it down to something that can be bare bones, actionable, and applicable. I hope I've saved some of you guys some time. And as always, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. And I'm going to walk, and then I'm going to turn the camera off.